picture this. You're getting ready for some big meeting about global trade, or maybe you just saw Harley Davidson on the street and it got you thinking about like international relations. Either way, get ready, because we're about to do a deep dive into a trade dispute that seriously shook things up a few years back.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about Trump's tariffs.
That's a great place to start because those tariffs, they weren't just about economics, you know what I mean? They were part of like a whole shift in how the U.S. approached trade under the Trump administration.
So we're not just talking about like a small import tax here, a small import tax there.
Oh, no, definitely not. This is way bigger. We're talking about a whole bunch of tariffs starting back in 2018 on goods worth billions and billions of dollars. And get this, it wasn't just from countries we think of as like rivals, like China. Trump put tariffs on steel and aluminum coming from countries that are supposed to be our close allies, like Canada, Mexico, and even the European Union.
Okay, so hold on. Why would we target our allies like that? What was the logic there?
Well, the administration at the time, they said it was all about national security. They were like, look, we can't be relying on other countries for all our steel and aluminum. What if there's like a crisis? They also said that these countries were doing some shady stuff when it came to trade. You know, engaging in unfair practices that were hurting American businesses.
But wouldn't that also hurt American businesses that rely on those imported materials?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like it would cut both ways, right?
Exactly. And that's where things start to get really interesting. You see these tariffs, they triggered a whole wave of responses from the countries that were targeted. They weren't just going to sit there and take it.
So what did they do? Did they just start throwing tariffs right back at us? Like a tit for tat kind of thing?
You bet they did. And they got pretty strategic about it, too. They picked their targets very carefully to make sure their message was heard, loud and clear.
Okay.
I'm intrigued. So, for example, Canada hit back with tariffs on like $16.6 billion worth of American goods.
Wow, that's a huge response.
Right. They meant business.
So what kind of stuff did they target?
Well, obviously, they went after U.S. steel and aluminum right back at us, but they also wanted to hit us where it hurts. You know?
Politically.
Exactly. So they picked things like whiskey ketchup, even orange juice. And all of this was coming from states that were really important to the Trump administration.
So it was all about applying pressure to specific lawmakers, basically using trade as a political tool.
Exactly. It wasn't just about the money. It was about sending a message. And the EU, they did the same thing. They put tariffs on some really iconic American products, you know, like Harley Davidson motorcycles, Levi's jeans, bourbon.
Oh, wow, the classics.
Right. And again, they were chosen for a reason. Those products had strong ties to certain regions and lawmakers.
It's almost like everyone's playing this game of chess, trying to outmaneuver each other with economics and politics all mixed up in it.
It was definitely a high-stakes game.
So what about Mexico? Did they get involved in this whole trade war too?
Oh, yeah. Mexico definitely jumped into the fight. They targeted American farmers specifically with tariffs on things like pork cheese.
Okay.
And you guessed it, more whiskey.
Really sticking it to the whiskey industry.
They were making a statement, that's for sure. The whole thing was a big escalation of tensions, and it made everyone wonder if anyone could actually win a trade war.
So did Trump's plan work? I mean, did they achieve what they were hoping for?
That's where things get really complicated. You know, there were winners and losers on both sides. Let's start with what the Trump administration might have seen as the pluses. Some U.S. industries, especially those making steel and aluminum, they actually benefited from the protection these tariffs offered. They had less competition from imports, and in some cases, it even led to more production here in the U.S.
Some of the things they were hoping for actually happened.
Yeah, but it's important to remember that these tariffs had a big impact on trade deals, too. For example, they were a major factor in why NAFTA,
the North American Free Trade Agreement,
that's the one had to be renegotiated. It had been around since the 90s, but it was eventually replaced by USMCA.
The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
Right.
I think most people have heard of that NAFTA getting replaced by USMCA. But what really changed?
Well, USMCA has some pretty big differences from NAFTA, like stricter rules about labor and digital trade.
Okay.
You know, things have changed a lot since the 90s.
Right.
So you could definitely argue that the pressure from these tariffs forced those three countries to modernize how they do business with each other.
So some possible wins for certain industries and a new trade deal. But I have a feeling there's another side to this whole story. What about the downsides? What didn't go according to plan?
Well, that's where things get a lot more complicated. On the other side, you have American consumers, and they ended up footing some of the bill. When businesses have to pay more for stuff they import from other countries, guess what happens?
They raise prices.
Exactly. They pass those extra costs on to their customers. So all of a sudden, things get more expensive for everyday people like you and me.
So you're saying these tariffs could have actually led to higher prices for everything?
It's definitely a possibility, and it doesn't stop there. Think about all the industries that rely on imported materials, like car manufacturers.
Okay.
The tariffs on steel and aluminum made those materials more expensive, which meant their production costs went up too. This actually led to job losses in some sectors.
Wow, so it's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and it's not always predictable.
Exactly. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. The tariffs might have helped some industries, but they hurt others and even hit consumers in the wallet. And there's more.
No.
Remember those retaliatory tariffs we talked about from Canada, Mexico, and the EU?
Yeah.
Well, those cause a lot of pain for American farmers and businesses trying to sell their products overseas. When those countries put tariffs on American goods like pork cheese and whiskey, it made it a lot harder for American companies to compete in those markets. A lot of farmers and exporters lost a ton of money.
So those carefully chosen products, they really made a difference.
They absolutely do. Things got so bad that the U.S. government actually had to step in and give billions of dollars in subsidies to farmers to try to help them out.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It was a huge problem. And here's something else that's really interesting. Even some of the people advising Trump on economic issues, they admitted that these tariffs had downsides, even though the administration was publicly supporting them.
So behind the scenes, they knew it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
It seems that way. It's complicated, right? You have winners and losers and unintended consequences.
Yeah, definitely a mixed bag. So all this happened during Trump's presidency. But what happened when Biden took office? Did he get rid of all this?
That's where the story takes another turn, and it might surprise you.
So we've got this really complicated picture with some people coming out ahead and some definitely feeling the pain from these trade wars and, of course, this whole new trade deal with USMCA.
Yeah.
And then there's a big question of what happened when Biden took over. Did he just scrap everything Trump had done or what?
Well, it wasn't exactly a complete 180. A lot of people thought Biden would just get rid of all the tariffs right away.
Right.
But he actually kept quite a few of them in place, especially the ones on goods from China.
Huh. So continuity on the China front. But what about those tariffs on our allies, like Canada and the EU?
Yeah.
Those had to go right.
Well, there have been some changes, but it's not a total wipe the slate clean situation.
Yeah.
The steel and aluminum tariffs on the EU, they were partially eased back in 2021.
Okay.
Which a lot of people saw as a good sign, like trying to mend those fences.
Right.
But it's not quite that simple. Since then, there have actually been some new trade restrictions put in place, just under different policies and with different reasons behind them.
So it sounds like even with a new president, global trade is still this kind of constantly shifting puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
What's driving all this back and forth?
Well, there are a few big things at play. One is that there are still a lot of concerns about how China does business, their trade practices and how much economic power they have. The Biden administration has been trying to work with other countries to deal with these concerns, but that tension is definitely still there.
That makes sense. It's not just about individual countries anymore. It's about global power dynamics. But haven't these trade wars shown that trying to go it alone isn't always the best strategy?
Exactly. And that's led to another really interesting development. Countries like Canada and the EU, they've been looking for ways to be less dependent on the U.S. market.
Makes sense.
They've been making new trade deals with other countries, diversifying their options so they're not so reliant on us.
So in a way, these trade wars have actually pushed other countries to find new partners and make new alliances.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. And this whole diversification of trade, it could have some pretty big long-term effects on the U.S. economy and how much influence we have globally.
Right, because if everyone else is making deals with each other, they don't need us as much.
Exactly. It's like a ripple effect. One policy change can trigger a whole chain reaction around the world.
It's fascinating, but also kind of scary. It's like a giant game of global chess where every move can change the whole board.
But beyond the economic impacts, what about the politics of it all? Have these trade wars done any lasting damage to relationships?
Oh, absolutely. Especially with countries that have been our allies for a long time, like Canada and the EU. Those trade disputes cause some real tension and mistrust.
Right.
There have been attempts to smooth things over, but the experience definitely left a mark. It raised questions about whether we could be trusted and whether those partnerships were as strong as we thought they were.
So even though Trump's not president anymore, his approach to trade could still be having an impact years later, both on the economy and on our relationships with other countries.
Yeah, it's definitely part of his legacy. But if we zoom out a bit, what does all this mean for the average person? Why should we care about all this trade stuff?
Right. That's a good question. It's easy to get lost in all the details and forget that it actually affects real people. That's a great point. This isn't just about some abstract economic policies. It's about real-world consequences that we all experience in one way or another.
So it's not just numbers and statistics. It's about people's lives.
Exactly. These trade wars have ripple effects that touch every corner of the globe and every aspect of our lives.
Wow.
They impact what jobs are available, what we can buy in stores, how much things cost, even how countries get along with each other.
It's wild to think about how one change in trade policy can set off this whole chain of events that affects us all, even if we don't realize it.
That's the thing about global systems. Everything's interconnected. And while the situation is still evolving, there are a few key things to keep in mind moving forward. First, the story of these trade wars isn't over yet.
Okay.
The decisions being made right now will have consequences for a long time to come.
So we're still living in the shadow of these trade wars, even though the initial fights have calmed down?
Exactly. And another important thing to remember is that the global trade scene is probably going to stay pretty volatile with all these different factors at play: economic competition, political tensions, new technologies popping up all the time.
Right.
The potential for more disputes is always there. So how do we make sense of all this? What can the average person do with all this information?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot here, from steel tariffs to ketchup and Harley-Davidsons and bourbon and NAFTA and USMCA. I mean, global trade sounds kind of like a roller coaster ride.
Yeah, it can definitely be wild.
Yeah.
But the big question is, where do we go from here? What can we actually do with all this information?
Right. It's easy to feel like, oh my gosh, this is so big and complicated. What can I even do about it?
That's a really common reaction. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these huge global issues, but just understanding them, that's actually the first step to making a difference.
So you're saying knowledge is power. Like, the more we know, the more we can actually do something.
Exactly. In this case, knowledge gives you the power to make smarter choices as a consumer, as a citizen, as a voter.
Okay. I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So let's say I was suddenly put in charge of U.S. trade policy. What should be my top priority?
That's a great question, and it's one that you really have to think carefully about. Would you focus on protecting American businesses and jobs, even if it means things cost more for people here? Or would you be more focused on working with other countries to make trade easier and boost the global economy?
That sounds like there's not an easy answer. You have to weigh a lot of different factors.
Yeah, there's no magic solution. And that's why it's so important to really think critically about these issues. There are always going to be trade-offs, and you have to think about the potential good and bad consequences of every decision.
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Sure. Let's think about those protectionist policies like tariffs. On the one hand, they can help shield certain industries from competition from other countries, which could lead to more production here in the U.S. and more jobs for Americans.
Okay, so there's a potential positive impact on certain parts of the economy.
Right. But on the other hand, those same policies can also make things more expensive for consumers and lead to other countries retaliating with their own tariffs. And it can even damage relationships between countries. It's all connected, you know?
Yeah, it really shows how trade policy isn't just about economics. It's about people and how countries interact with each other. So what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this whole deep dive into trade wars?
I think the biggest takeaway is that trade policy has a real impact on all of us. It affects our jobs, what we can buy, the prices we pay, how countries get along. It's not something that's happening in some far-off world. It's part of our everyday lives.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that what happens on the world stage actually matters to us here at home. It's not just something we hear about on the news. It affects us personally. So we've gone from steel to ketchup, from Harley-Davidsons to bourbon, from NAFTA to USMCA.
Right, we've covered a lot of ground.
We've seen how one change in policy can have this ripple effect with consequences that are felt all over the world.
And it's not over yet. This whole story of trade wars is still unfolding. It's something we need to keep paying attention to because the decisions being made right now are going to shape the world we live in tomorrow.
So what's the message for our listeners? What should they do with all this new knowledge?
Stay curious. Stay informed, and don't be afraid to ask questions. The more we understand about these complicated issues, the better equipped we'll be to make a difference.
I love that. That's a great place to wrap things up. We've learned a lot today, but it's really just the beginning of the conversation. There's always more to learn and explore. So keep diving deep. Keep asking those tough questions and keep engaging with the world around you. Who knows, maybe you'll be the one shaping the future of global trade.